Hi, thank you all for joining us. I'm Dannagal Young. I'm a professor of communication and political science at the University of Delaware and director of the Center for Political Communication, and I'm author of a book called Wrong: How Media, Politics, and Identity Drive Our Appetite for Misinformation, a book that examines not the supply side of misinformation, but why it is that people are attracted to information that's demonstrably false. So I've been asked to set up the discussion today. So I'm going to take about 5 minutes to talk about some big themes that I would love for our panelists to tackle. And then I will introduce our panelists and we'll have an open dialogue. And then for the last 15 minutes or so, we will be opening it up to questions. So if you do have questions, please keep those in mind because we will have time starting at around, I believe it's 11:25. So each year, in my Introduction to Media and Society course at the University of Delaware, I teach media law in the U.S. context, and it is a very weird enterprise teaching U.S. media law. There's not really a lot to teach because there aren't really a lot of laws. Students are very surprised to learn, in fact, how little media regulation that we have in the United States, especially today. And what little regulation we had was typically dismantled in the 1980s. So this panel is about ethics and in the tension between A, what can we do, and B, what should we do? The answers are along the lines of A, just about anything we want, and B, probably something different from what it is we're doing right now. In that course, I talk about how there are different models of media regulation, three of which, the big ones, an authoritarian model, like we see in China and Russia, where media systems and infrastructure are regulated by the state and are treated as an extension of the regime that's in power. Then there's a social responsibility model, like we see in Europe, where media organizations operate largely independent of the state, but are regulated when their content economics or ownership patterns are found to pose risks to individuals and society. And then, of course, there's what we have here in the US, which is a libertarian model, one in which media systems operate almost entirely independent of the government. Regulation is very limited, and the private business interests that own media and platforms are expected to self-correct, what we call the self-righting principle that assumes the marketplace of ideas will reward the best ideas, that is, the helpful, the truthful ones, while punishing the bad ideas and the harmful and hateful ones, like misinformation and disinformation. But these different models of media regulation have come up against global decentralized logics of digital technologies. Digital technologies are decentralized by design, which makes them porous and difficult to harness, which can be brilliantly democratizing. They can be used to amplify the voices of the marginalized and oppressed. They can be used to get around traditional gatekeepers, facilitate collective action, and set the agendas of mainstream journalists. We know that digital technologies can allow power and agency to migrate downstream in a very democratic way, away from elites into the hands of citizens. However, the economics of law and logics of America's deregulated media infrastructure also has us in what I would like to call a bit of a pickle. How so? Well, if you don't know the names, Drs. Paul Lazarsfeld and Robert Merton, they were communication scholars at Columbia University in the 1940s. They were among the first to apply quantitative methods to the study of media effects. In 1948, in response to widespread fears among scholars and the public about the potential of media to serve as a vehicle for propaganda, they published an essay that I like to call the Stop Freaking Out Everyone essay, because they argued that in democratic capitalist societies like the US, where media operated independent of the government, media infrastructures wouldn't and even couldn't be leveraged to facilitate large-scale social or political change. Lazarsfeld and Merton even articulated 3 criteria that media systems would have to meet for propaganda to be successful. And one by one, they explained how those criteria just couldn't be met in the US in 1948. So, my friends, it's not 1948 anymore, Toto. In 2020, I wrote a piece with my friend and colleague Shannon McGregor at UNC that explained how the very criteria that they had articulated that couldn't be met in 1948 are not only satisfied today, but digital technologies check these three boxes so well, in fact, that they're tailor-made for propaganda, and we're seeing it every day. They argued that for propaganda to be successful, it would have to monopolize the environment with little to no counter-propaganda, which they said was impossible in 1948. But today, the environment as a whole might not be able to be monopolized by one message, but through curated news feeds and algorithms, each of us can cultivate a personalized information environment that allows us to see little to no content that pushes back or contradicts our worldview. Number two, they argued that propaganda would have to build upon pre-existing values and beliefs. They basically said the most propaganda could do is build on something that people already believe, which would not change society in a fundamental way. And because it was impossible in 1948 to know at a granular level what individuals valued and believed in such a way that could be exploited by propagandists, people shouldn't worry. But today, folks, building upon pre-existing values and beliefs is exactly how digital technologies exist. It's how they make money. It's how Meta earned $135 billion in revenue in 2023. Did you know 97% of Meta's revenue comes from advertising? They're an advertising platform. So what makes those ads successful is leveraging our individual data for purposes of micro-targeting. This is literally satisfying that criterion that they had talked about that couldn't be satisfied in 1948. And they also suggested that if propaganda were to be successful, it would have to be supplemented by interpersonal communication consistent with that message. Folks, social media and digital technologies embed our media experiences within an interpersonal communication network. It's all part of media producer strategies as they create and disseminate content within communities, within social networks. So what? Well, we've seen so what. Social media are the machinery of propaganda. We saw how Russia used all of these tactics, these very tactics, to try to subvert American democracy through social media in 2016. We saw how Cambridge Analytica exploited Facebook user data to try to influence democratic processes and elections. Right, Carole? Given that in the US, the First Amendment seems to require a hands-off, libertarian approach to media regulation, the question that I open with is, what ethical obligations do journalists or digital media corporations or media platforms have to protect democracy in America or around the world? And what obligations do digital technology platforms have to protect and support American journalism or journalism around the globe? And so, to address these questions, hold on, where's my message? There we go. To address these questions and themes related to ethical responsibilities of media organizations, it is my honor to introduce, we will start on the left, investigative journalists for The Guardian and Observer who helped to break the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal, Carole Cadwalladr. Professor and founding director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab at American, Cynthia Miller-Idriss. And editor of Press Watch and committed supporter of democratic-centered and accountability journalism, Dan Froomkin. So I guess I'll open it up to my friends here. What are the ethical obligations of our media corporations to protect American democracy or democracy around the globe? Anyone want to take it first?
Small question.
I mean, I figured I'd start small. We can get bigger.
Sure, this is on. Yeah, this is on. I mean, I come at this from a media literacy standpoint rather than a regulation standpoint, so I'm really curious to hear what others think about the issue of regulation. And but I think in a moment when the kinds of bad content that I work on, which is conspiracy theories, propaganda, supremacist types of thinking, misogyny, and other types of hateful and harmful content online, which is ubiquitous and unrelenting in the way that it comes to people across their screens, especially young people, and platforms like online gaming or in memes or other types of spaces where they spend time. I think there's an obligation to help inform people about how propaganda works, how manipulation works, and how to recognize and reject it. If we cannot count on the companies to self-regulate and we cannot count on the government to regulate, which I don't think we can, I think we have to see a commitment to media literacy and a really scaled up commitment.
So I'm going to take the media literacy point in a second, but when it comes to the question of media regulation, and I tend to agree, it doesn't seem like in the US we are equipped to do that. Carole, I would love to turn it to you a little bit to think maybe more globally about these different models and how the US compares, because we are weird. We're wonderful, but we are weird.
Thank you, Dannagal. It's such big questions, and I'm really conscious of where we are and when we are. So we're in Wilmington, and we're just a few months ahead of this really critical election in the USA. And the one thing we know for certain, the only thing perhaps we know for certain, is that what happens next is going to happen on social media. So the pivotal and consequential memes and narratives and stories we're going to be sort of understanding about this moment are going to be flooding every single social media platform that you're on. And those platforms have no ethical responsibilities, and they have no legal responsibilities, barely even, in what they are going to be telling us during this time. And that is a terrifying thought, I think. And we have arrived at this moment. We haven't done anything about these technology platforms and their responsibility and involvement in our society, and particularly in our democracy. And there has been no regulation. That we as people in this system have no protections. Our data is there for these companies to harvest up and then to use in very covert and invisible ways to sort of target us with individual messages. And, I think we are past a point of inflection on that. But I look out into this audience where I can see there's lots of young people, and the only thing which gives me hope in this moment is that it's you guys who are going to think, actually, there is something wrong here. And I can see it in my friends and myself that I'm on these digital platforms and they're addicting me and they're making me anxious and they're making me scared, and I know that there's information out there which isn't good, and you are the ones who are going to stand up and say, well, actually, this isn't right and it's not good enough and we need something different. So thank you in advance for that. Just no pressure.
So I'm going to follow up with one thing, and then I want to turn to Dan about journalism. But you said that they have no ethical obligation, but remember, for a long time, a lot of these platform executives like Mark Zuckerberg and then Jack Dorsey, before he was Elon Musk, I don't think that's the way you say that, that they said that they are not responsible for the content that is on their platforms, right? They're protected by Section 230. And so they say, we're not responsible for user-generated content. We're just a space where people communicate. But then after revelations came out about how especially Facebook was exploited by these Russian troll accounts, Zuckerberg said in a congressional testimony, we do bear responsibility for what is on our platforms. Which seemed like it was an opportunity for like a change in the conversation. But then as platforms began monitoring content, monitoring misinformation, there was such pushback, especially from the right, so much so that in fact there are congressional hearings that Jim Jordan has opened, bringing in a lot of the scholars who study this space, arguing that right-wing voices or conservative voices are being silenced. So what do you think happened in that moment?
I think just to go back to the big picture here, which is that this idea that the platforms, Mark Zuckerberg has no responsibility for what happens on his platform. And we're looking here at sort of bad things which may happen in the US in the upcoming months. I think the thing which is often forgotten is those bad things have happened elsewhere in the world. And the platforms have taken no responsibility. And we actually, as journalists, have failed to hold them to account for this. So I'm going to tell you one very specific story in this, which is in Myanmar, used to be called Burma, in the Far East. There was a terrible event which happened a few years ago, which was a genocide of people, Rohingya Muslims, who were targeted on social media. And Facebook, as ever, went, well, that has nothing to do with us. But then the United Nations wrote a report and said it played a role in facilitating this genocide. And Mark Zuckerberg has never been held to account for that. And we have allowed him to get away with it. And so I think I know you're asking a specific question about the attempts which Congress have made around this, but this, I think part of this is the American exceptionalism, that really look in the rest of the world for examples of what's to come for the US. This has already happened in other places.
So Dan, you have written about, and you are really a proponent of a form of journalism that is very protective, like explicitly protective of American democracy. And I was hoping that you can talk to us about what that is, what that looks like, and what are the ethical obligations of journalists to be explicitly pro-democracy, which sounds great, but why might folks push back against that? Like, what is that?
Listening to all of you describe this incredibly dystopian present we're in, where we have the platforms have this unimaginable ability to spread misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. I think to myself that there's one bulwark left against this, and that's the traditional media. The government isn't going to intervene on a practical basis in terms of regulating speech, but the traditional media still exists and is still there. And so I ask myself, well, how much has it changed? Given these new challenges? And the answer is it hasn't. There's been no, especially in the area that I look at, which is political journalism in particular, there's been no really dramatic change in how traditional media covers politics. And it seems to me that there's a tremendous obligation, first and foremost, to fight disinformation, fight misinformation, fight propaganda, as aggressively and enthusiastically as its distributors distribute it. And that, for instance, there have been polls recently just showing how misinformed Americans are about certain issues. I think that should be a call to arms for all traditional media to say, in fact, to actually do more polls, to say, well, what don't people understand? What facts do people get wrong about the economy, about authoritarianism, about any of these issues? And then say, well, then our job is going to be to actually redress this, to inform people, and not just with one story and then say we've done it before, which is the traditional media sort of way of doing it, but coming back to it over and over again and addressing media literacy. Who else is going to do that? I mean, I'd love to see our public schools do it, but I don't think that's going to happen. So these are important roles for traditional media to take up, and they're just not. They're just failing completely to do so. All these things could fall under the umbrella of pro-democracy journalism. Obviously, part of it also is making sure that people understand that democracy is being threatened at this point, and reporting about that aggressively. Again, not just one story. I mean, the New York Times did a fabulous series over the period of 6-month period about a year ago about the incredibly dangerous proposals that Trump and MAGA are making that would erode democracy and erode the government as we know it. But then they sort of stopped, and their daily coverage is still basically the kind of coverage you'd expect in any other era. And this is an unusual era, and the traditional media needs to step up in a way that it just simply hasn't.
So building on that question of sort of literacy, what I hear you saying is that you have journalists engaging in typical campaign reporting like they always do, right? Which for those who aren't familiar with this space, it usually consists of like coverage of polls, horse race reporting, who's ahead and who's behind, what's the latest scandal on the trail, right? And journalists will tend to cover less of specific policy proposals that the candidates are advancing, in part because it's not as exciting, and in part because the people following the candidates on the trail, they've heard the stump speeches with the policies over and over, and so it's not interesting to them. But I'm wondering if, in addition to what we're talking about with giving information about specific policy proposals, what about using journalism as a place to remind people what civics are, how democracy works, how the systems work, how the institutions work? And I'm wondering about the combination of that with media literacy as well, like a sort of civics media literacy. I'll ask you, and then you, Cynthia.
No, absolutely. And I think there's one way to do it, is even hewing fairly closely to the conventional way of covering things. But the next time some politician says something really offensive about immigration or about immigrants or about trans people, instead of just reporting he said this, you say, this is what fascists do. This is how an authoritarian rises to power, by othering people, by creating outgroups, by demonizing them. That sort of civic education, I think right now the most important civic education is looking at the authoritarian playbook and seeing how the authoritarian playbook that we've seen has been used by authoritarian leaders throughout history is now being used in this country, and to take specific things that happen on the campaign trail and tie them into that as a way of educating the public.
Cynthia, when you talk about media literacy, how do you see that fitting in with some of these conversations about understanding of civics and these fundamental issues?
Yeah, I mean, the kinds of things that you're mentioning around how democracy works and the sort of nuts and bolts type of thing, I think we haven't done a very good job of, and we definitely need to improve. And I think that what I'm talking about when I'm talking about media literacy is even a more fundamental degree of education about how what you consume online shapes your beliefs about human dignity, about consent, autonomy, about excuse me for saying things that are a little hard to hear, but this Peggy Ornstein op-ed that some of you may have read in the New York Times that reported on a research study recently showing that a majority of college-age women now report having been choked during sex, often against their own wishes in the majority of cases, and that is traced back to young men's overconsumption of violent pornography and what they think constitutes pleasure. That's what I mean about changing the way people think, the way people behave based on what they've consumed online, that you could have such a skewed understanding of what consent or pleasure looks like. And I think the reason that connects to democracy is because we now have at least 7 nationally representative surveys from the US, the UK, and other countries showing that the single biggest predictor, or among the top 3 predictors of support for violent extremism or political violence and willingness to engage in political violence, is sexism or misogyny, depending on how it's defined in the study. And so that type of stuff, that type of content online, consuming harmful, hateful, vile, dehumanizing content, whether in pornography or in a chat room or in an Andrew Tate video or whatever it is, shapes the way you think in ways that are having political outcomes about violence and about democracy. So that's a different level. I mean, I'm going tonight to my own kids' high school's porn parent education thing because of this Peggy Ornstein article. They're now doing this. It's a media literacy event for parents, right? That is, unusual. I feel lucky that they're doing it. They've integrated it into health and sex education classes. That's the type of thing I think we need to see more of in terms of conversations, since we know that this is affecting support for political violence. That's
Sure.
a different and difficult thing conversation to have. Yep. Parents don't want to think about it. No, Florida and Texas don't want to talk about it, right?
And people are very uncomfortable talking about it.
very uncomfortable.
But I think that's something that might be useful too, and maybe you could shed some light on this. I think you were kind of getting at this when we were in the green room. Could you help us understand the mechanism, or why is it that these kinds of the violent language and the violent pornography has these political implications, not just political violence, but support for extremism itself? Like, how does that, I mean, it's a very tricky question. This is like your book, but in relation to gender dynamics, et cetera, what is it about it that has that political set of ramifications?
Well, one thing we know is that it's always been there, and we just haven't documented it very well. So, for example, well over half of mass shootings in the U.S., one of the targets of that shooting was a lover, a wife, or a partner, right? I mean, this is essentially this connection between sort of intimate partner domestic violence and mass shootings, including terrorism, is very high. In almost every single case of terrorism in the U.S. and abroad, you have, and across all ideological forms, you have prior cases of domestic violence, harassment, stalking, online rape threats, even things like the Uvalde shooting, the elementary school, that never have ideology, had that history, right? So those things are always and have always been there. I think we're now seeing it documented in support for political violence, which is also rising. So the questions about how that happens, I think there's a lot of theories on it. We do need a lot more research. But I think, if we know what the predictors are, we know what the biggest predictors are, and we see these violent outcomes happening, it seems to me at least a starting point would either be to understand the mechanisms through which that happens, but also work to prevent the baseline predictors that are so clear in the research to begin with.
What would also be great is if you read about it in the traditional media. It's astonishing the level of blackout that there is in the traditional media to all issues related to misogyny, hostile sexism. I mean, I think that it explains a lot of what's going on in politics right now. I was amazed that after the Dobbs decision, which took away the right to bodily freedom for women, that there was very little mention of misogyny as a factor. When the rise of Christian nationalists, like our new Speaker of the House, the incredible, important role of this visceral hatred, contempt, wanting to take away rights from women, is so absent in the media, and it's another perfect example of how they're missing the boat.
Carole,
Can I actually, I think that this is really interesting, and I'm really conscious because there are a lot of young people here, and I just keep on thinking, how does this relate to them? And my question is, I guess, who in the audience has seen the trad wife phenomenon on social media? Have you seen that on TikTok or Instagram?
The trad wife?
Trad wife.
TikToks?
Yeah, and I just wonder, because it's kind of like, it's very engaging content in some ways. It's these very pretty women in a kitchen with loads of kids baking delicious meals. And that just seems like something which floats past your eyes. But it actually really connects to the things which we're talking about here, which is that this sort of essentially how you guys are consuming the things we're talking about here around misogyny and around women's rights to birth control and to abortion. I just wondered, maybe you guys, you're much better at reflecting on this than I am, but I just thought bringing it into that context of like, this doesn't, the way that it filters out into the culture and into the way that young people consume this is, we don't even notice it. I saw loads of trad wife content and found it sort of fascinating, but really didn't think on it around like things like Roe v. Wade and how it sort of infected, sort of spoke to that.
Could I just real quick, and I think that adjacent to that and probably more common are the videos that I know I've seen, and I have a 14-year-old daughter and all of her friends see, which are videos that really celebrate young people who have been together since middle school, who get married really young and they have babies really young. And like, look how great it is because now I'm 30, but I have 7 kids and I'm so young, and look at all.
And it looks like a really amazing lifestyle in many
Yes.
ways. They make it look so effortless having 13 children. But mostly 13 children and bake your own bread by first picking the wheat yourself. But it turns out that a lot of them are like married to multi-millionaires and have a load of nannies sitting in the back room. And all they have to do is make this beautiful content which goes out on social media. Maybe to talk about media literacy, that isn't true.
Well, that's part of what I mean about media literacy is understanding the facade, and understanding what someone's trying to sell you or package, and what things might actually look like behind the scenes. But I also, I run this research lab now that tries to do interventions with young people and with the communities that surround them. And so we spend a lot of time with high school and middle school students. And something really sticks out to me when we ask them about this, when we ask teenagers, what should adults be doing? The very first thing they say, last year in a high school, a boy raised his hand and he said, I wish adults would stop being so sanctimonious about it, right? First of all, it's like great vocabulary word. Like that's amazing, right? He was a freshman. Like I was really impressed. But then this year we were in a middle school with my college students and asked the same question. And they said, two 11-year-old boys said, whatever you do, don't make it preachy, which is the same exact thing as sanctimonious, right? Just a simpler word. So, in a totally different school, totally different age, that's not completely different age, but similar. I think that adults are getting this wrong too, right? When we try to do media literacy, we're finger wagging at these kids like all social media is bad. There's nothing good about it. Turn off your phones, lock them up before you go to school. And there are some good outcomes to those research studies of what happens when you put your phones away at the right? Like I'm not saying that's not a solution, but I think we have to collaborate with kids and teens on what does make for meaningful interventions that aren't about preachy, sanctimonious, finger-wagging interventions.
So I want to kind of pivot a little bit to the question of like political journalism and democracy, just to get us sort of back in the main lane here. One of the things that I think is challenging about a lot of these conversations is that we see these things as like these would be pro-social effects if people had critical thinking skills, if they were media literate, if they push back against some of these misogynistic narratives. We think that it would be pro-social to have reporting that's pro-democratic, that allows people to understand the issues, that calls out authoritarianism where it is. But for journalists who are striving for press objectivity, who feel as though their job is to report on the issues, they might not be comfortable calling out things when that might be portrayed as biased. Right? So this is a huge, huge battle in coverage of the election right now. But I think it also plays a role here too. Like even whether or not you are condemning some of these like trad wife things, et cetera, and talking about the dangers of it, that in and of itself could be framed as having an ideological bias. So how do we deal with that? How should journalists deal with that?
Well, objectivity doesn't mean that you give up your ability to set the agenda and tell people what's important. Objectivity these days has been sort of dumbed down to you just tell both sides and stay out of the way. And that's simply not an acceptable way of doing journalism at this point.
Yeah, I would just add, I liken the situation we're in now often to a public health crisis. And in the real medical world of public health, what happened was that we realized it's not very effective to just wait until people are diagnosed with diabetes or cardiac disease before we intervene, but that you actually 20 years upstream can help communities understand what heart healthy habits are, how you exercise, what it looks like to eat better. And you're not making them do that. You're not telling them you have to make these choices. You're informing them about the choices they can make that are healthier for them, their families, their life outcomes, their well-being. And I think that's where we find in our lab that parents in particular and grandparents across the board, Republicans and Democrats, come to the table to learn about what their kids are seeing online. That is not a partisan issue. Maybe you get into a little bit of partisan discussion about trad wives, about choices, about conservative patriarchal arrangements, etc., if you're talking about misogyny. But nobody wants their kid to become violent, right? Nobody wants their kid to be in an unhealthy relationship that includes unhealthy outcomes for them. And so I think you can still find ways to wade through this that emphasize choice, that emphasize censorship reduction, that that emphasize healthy outcomes without making people make choices or trying to persuade them of the choices they're supposed to make.
Did you want to follow up, Carole?
I mean, I think it's grossly dishonest of journalists in this present moment to pretend that both sides are equal, when one side is seeking to rip up our democratic institutions and one side is not. And I think the vast majority of people can see that that's dishonest to maintain this godlike view of we're not involved, we're just reporting on the facts. One fact is that the candidate has said that he's going to be an authoritarian on day one, and on the other side, they haven't. They believe in a rules-based order. So I got, in the course of my reporting, because I was reporting on very contentious political issues around what happened in Britain in this Brexit referendum and also the 2016 election, I got called, a really big insult which was leveled at me was that I was called an activist, not a journalist. And for a while I was like, oh no, that's really bad. They're just like trying to destroy my reputation, blah, blah, blah. What do I do? And then actually I met a very inspiring journalist who is called Miller-Idriss, who is a Filipino journalist and who won the Nobel Prize. And she's ex-CNN, she's very experienced, but she lives in a country that has seen its democracy destroyed, and it's seen how social media was weaponized there. And she very boldly says, of course I'm an activist. Of course we all have to be activists in this moment because we're activists for truth. And we're activists for facts, and we're activists for evidence-based reporting and evidence-based science. We all have to be activists and citizens in this moment. And this sort of, I think, one of the problems with the mainstream media is so out of touch, and it so is not realizing that actually it's also sort of irrelevant, that most people, as we saw earlier in this room, are getting their news from social media. And part of the reason they're getting their news from social media is because it's less boring and more honest in some ways, but it's also grossly misleading and you don't know who it's coming from and they're not actually journalists. So we actually, I think, have this responsibility to be more interesting, to be more honest, and to talk to the audience where they are, which is on these platforms.
No, exactly. And the notion that it would be some sort of a step down for traditional media to engage with the social media universe, that's absolutely the imperative right now, both in terms of moral imperative and in terms of just getting audience.
And I love that Maria Ressa has entered the chat. She is such an inspiration. The notion that journalists must be activists for truth is paramount. I often tell my students, because I am of the same mind as you, Dan, where I feel that journalists have an obligation to be actively pro-democracy, because if they are not, the underlying logic and ethos of their job and their profession changes. If they are not activists for truth and pro-democracy, and then we sort of let in an authoritarian structure and order, they are no longer journalists. They are public relations experts, right? They work on behalf, at the behest of the president. So I'm very mindful of our time here. I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to hear some voices from the room. So if you have, I see a question already. Yeah, right here in front. Do we have, good, we have runners.
Thank you so much all for being here. Just wanted to say that there's been a lot of talk that we live in a tech feudalism, basically the economy of surveillance, where big tech companies have so effortlessly permeated our privacy, our personal lives, our political choices. I just wanted to ask, how can we regulate this on a policy-making level, and if our governments or institutions have the genuine power to sanction these companies? Thank you.
Carole, do you want to?
I mean, and I'd love to hear from any of the young people here as well on this, which is that so the basis of this is our privacy. That's one thing. Which, if you actually had proper data laws in the US, then this whole business model, would not be possible. And also, and I just think, I know that that's a sort of this. There's a higher view here, but also, as individuals, I think thinking about that from your own point of view of you must get all sorts of ads being directed at you when you're looking at TikTok or Instagram. And that is because these companies are hoovering up all this information about you in order to then sell you things. And I think you should be really worried about what they know about you and what they think they know about you and what they get wrong. And I think we have to really, as well as thinking about the big policy things, really think about what it is like for us as individuals, and especially for young people being on these platforms.
Great.
Dana, you were talking about the marketplace of ideas being something that was raised up as a solution to many of our problems in the earlier decades ago, and now it's been utterly perverted by these gigantic tech platforms and their algorithms. And I do think that addressing the privacy issues is one way. I don't think you're going to end up with a situation where you want a bureaucrat to be line editing Facebook. But there are still things we can do on the privacy front, and also, frankly, in terms of breaking these platforms up. I think there's a very strong anti-monopoly argument to be made, and if you decentralize these algorithms, then you can give people control of them again, potentially.
Great. Let's see if there are other questions. Do I see other hands out there? Other questions? So I kind of wanted to follow up with regards to something we talked about backstage, which is that a lot of these tech companies were born out of the American context. And I am, as I often confess, I'm a proud defender of American exceptionalism. I am the rare college professor who does. And I think that the reason that a lot of these tech platforms were born in the US is because of our public education system, which, while it may be struggling, is still among the best in the world. It's because we have a robust marketplace. It's because of venture capital, and it's because we're a culture that really rewards innovation, experimentation, and openness. And that is a kind of environment in which you get entrepreneurial spirit and innovation and invention. So because of that, I firmly believe that these companies that were born out of that kind of cultural context have an obligation to defend and protect the pluralistic, liberal, democratic system that gave rise to them. And I would just love to hear a little bit of what you think.
They don't care, Dannagal. They don't care. They're just making shit tons of money and buying. Oh, sorry, was that a rude word to use here? And they're buying their private islands, and they're going to be absolutely fine.
But at some level, can't that argument, though, about the fact that the reason that they came from this soil is because of what this soil has given them? At some level, can't that argument be used to compel some kind of policy regulation, breaking them up, etc.?
Well, one of the things I would like to see is more pressure from international governments and the United Nations on the US itself. I think that the evidence shows we export the majority of white supremacist propaganda that circulates globally. We exported QAnon. The last 2 terrorist attacks in Germany were live streamed or attempted to live stream in English, or the manifesto was written in English so that they could be shared globally on these platforms. We produce the platforms on which this stuff happens, on which the Christchurch terrorist attack is live streamed, right, et cetera, et cetera. Imagine for just a second that level of harm was coming from any other country related to Islamist extremism.
That is a great
Imagine
thought
what the
experiment.
US would do, right? What pressure we would put internationally on those governments. And we get none of that. We get a complete free pass from every other government, from the UN, about the active harms we're doing globally.
Not from China.
Right, not from China. Okay. But I think, we can't just expect the citizenry to bubble this up and put pressure. We need pressure from other governments to hold us accountable and to hold this country accountable for what we're doing.
That is fascinating. And I'm going to play Carole for a second and say, would the US care? Right? I don't know.
I love that idea. I just don't know how. Where is it? How would that work? And a very useful one. You talked about Germany, and I think it's really helpful to realise. So Germany is one of the few countries in the world which can hold the tech companies to account, and get things off the platform. And that is because it has really strict hate speech laws. So I think Facebook, 1 in 6 moderators that it employs works on German language content because they have to, because there's a law. And the reason why that exists is because of Nazis, because Germany went through this process of understanding what happens when violent extremism takes over a country and what that looks like. And a genocide of 6 million people, that is what led it to these laws. And I think that's a really salutary lesson to remember. And the fact is that these laws don't exist elsewhere, and that content is out flooding the platforms. And if you think about what the Nazi Party would be doing now if it was online, and what it would be doing is quite similar to what groups in the US are doing, which is it is spreading ideas about white supremacism. It's spreading ideas about women's place being in the home. It's spreading ideas about violence as a solution for political ideas. And so that is, I think, the really clear thing you should have in your mind. And so, yes, the owners of these tech companies, they have ethical responsibilities which they do not feel and they do not act on. And I believe they are at this moment resistant to shame. But maybe, I don't know what it's going to take to get them there.
I would just add, since we're on the Nazi example, we were talking about before the backstage, that it took about 15 years for the democratic Weimar Republic to collapse into the Nazi regime. We've been on a list of backsliding democracies globally now for 2 years, and it takes on average about 9 years for countries to get off that list in one direction or the other. So, collapse or sort of restored into democratic stability. And, so people always ask me, like, what can we do to prevent political violence before the election, right? Like, well, I'm not that optimistic about that, to be honest, but I am optimistic. I am an optimist by nature, and I do think in a 7 to 10 year window we can intervene. But we have to intervene. We can't just keep letting this slope keep sliding down. And so, this isn't a quick fix. And so, sorry for the negative assessment of what's going to happen in the next 5 months. But the long-term prospects, I think we have time, and we have to not just look at the short-term needs.
But in the short term, though, what you're hearing, though, is that the threat of violent, extremist political violence is upon us, is almost imminent in the coming months. And this is something which we should all be concerned about. Traditional media should be writing about instead of complaining about, the perils of wokeism.
The question that we had earlier about civics education and the extent to which journalists are responsible for perhaps not fundamentally educating people about how democracy works, but perhaps reminding us how democracy works. One of the things that I don't think people understand enough is that democracies are often dismantled through the levers of democracy. Democracies are not typically taken by force. Democracies are dismantled through the institutions and processes and levers of democracy. That is what happened in Nazi Germany. right? They use the democratic processes to change their society and their political government to an authoritarian, to a fascist system. They voted for that. So I think that at a very basic level seems like something people could be reminded of, perhaps, that's, hey, remember that? We only have a minute left. One of the things I'm fascinated by in this conversation is a lot of the things we're talking about in terms of the kinds of content that get amplified across these platforms is, you might not call it political with a capital P, like it's not related to elections, it doesn't seem to be about politicians, but it's ideological, it's about gender, it's about race, it's perhaps about crime. And I think that's why they have gone under the radar so much, because they're not easily labeled as political. But I'm wondering if you could talk for a second about that, because that seems like that content is the content that's doing a whole lot of work out there.
Yeah, the term that the US government now uses is hate-fueled violence and then political violence, right? And so one of the frustrating things we're seeing is this complete unwillingness to actually talk about political violence because of the fear that it's partisan. And so actually there's a lot more energy going into hate-fueled violence and prevention of hate-fueled violence right now than there is into the prevention of political violence. So even though all the assessments say, as Dan said, it's going to happen. Like, we are going to have political violence in the next 5 months, but nobody wants to talk about it. Right.
January 6th was it.
Yeah. Yeah. And there will be, the kidnapping plot against the Michigan governor, right? There's dozens of incidents like that are also off the radar, that those plots get interrupted and not covered. And I do think the traditional media is hesitant to talk about it for the same reasons. I know the government is refusing to talk about it for those reasons. And so I'm glad that we're seeing strategy after strategy come out of the government on how to combat gender-based violence, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, all kinds of issues related to hate-fueled violence. But the silence on political violence, I think, is part of the problem.
Any final thoughts before we wrap up here?
Mine is just, so we're not going to come up with the answers. It's the young folk, you out there. You are the ones who are going to have to fix this terrible problem that we've left you with. And there are young people out there who are doing it. There's an amazing coalition called Design It For Us. And that is teenagers and young people who are being activists around getting the law changed so that there's more protections for them online. And it's an amazing first step. And I urge you to check it out.
Great. Final thoughts? No? So thank you so much. And thank you so much to our panelists. This has been a real privilege to have this conversation with you.